large sums of people that come to this country actually have a genuine hatred towards Western values and Western culture.
Hatred?
Yeah, I don't know how else you could describe it.
You've talked about Islam publicly.
The demographic in this country is changing quite drastically. What is the impact of this?
Can we talk about two-tier Britain?
We saw the riots in terms of the two-tier policing there, but I think it goes a lot deeper. Unfortunately, I think people are scared to actually voice what they're thinking.
Where has that malaise come from?
The group of people who are suffering the most are British white boys. The numeracy rates, the literacy rates are all declining. So it doesn't matter what race you are, black, white, brown, you're going to be in a country whose productivity is going to be on the decline. But this will never be talked about. Let's find something or a cause that we don't actually really fully understand, whether it's climate change, BLM, attacking the far right, the trans community, and we've decided that that's going to be our purpose.
What is it to be British? What is it that unites us all?
We in Britain, I think, have done a terrible job in terms of making the values clear and actually standing up for them.
What do you think is the correct approach to dealing with this issue?
You've got to be very careful when you talk about this stuff.
Sunil, great to speak to you. Thanks for coming in. We are just at the aftermath of Hugh Edwards, the BBC reporter who has been sentenced to 2 months, or I should say, he's been given a 6-month suspended sentence for a period of 2 years, having been pled guilty to making indecent images and having indecent images. This in a context in Britain of a sense of two-tier justice, of two-tier policing. Of course, we had the English riots. We're also coming out the back of Notting Hill Carnival, Hare Hills. There's a sense, at least, of a two-tier system. The reason I wanted to speak to you is that I've seen you doing media and that you've been very clear-cut, straight to the point, and as far as I can tell, a truth talker on some of the most prickly, difficult issues in Britain today. So thank you so much for coming to speak with me. I look forward to speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into it, I wondered for audience who aren't familiar with you, just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into media.
Yeah, sure. So I work full-time in finance. That's my day-to-day. The media stuff is more of a sort of stumbled into it, if you like. My dad used to be involved in politics since I was maybe 12, 13 years old, and naturally I'd be his sort of helper, and just whether it's posting leaflets through letterboxes or, doing some of his speeches. And he was a local level councillor, and I think that just started my interest. He was a Conservative councillor at a time when I think he was if not the first, one of the first in Windsor and Maidenhead immigrant Conservative councillors.
What did you say that? What?
Immigrant Conservative councillor. Okay. So it wasn't a very common thing back then, even though large populations of the Indian community, Pakistani community, different, these backgrounds are largely conservative in the way they are socially in particular, as well as economically. It wasn't a very common thing maybe 15, 20 years ago as it is necessarily now. Uh-huh. And so I think that really, him at a very young age, really influenced me in terms of his not being afraid to speak the truth in any form. He would sit and have conversations about the British Empire, for example, with some maybe my cousins who were born here, who would say, it's the worst thing ever, and he'd give the context, and you'd have no problem in any environment just to speak his truth. And I think I've definitely got some of that from him.
Oh, I see.
And then I just sort of stayed actively involved and kind of just stumbled into the media world of politics.
And is your father sort of a contrarian, or is it that he really believed these things?
He's got very strong principles. He's got very strong principles, very strong morals. There's nothing he would not, he has no fear in terms of speaking his truth or his mind. He'll read a lot. He still does. He's just that kind of person who just, he says what he believes in, and he'll do it with authority, and it may annoy people or upset. He just doesn't have that care. He's maybe a bit more sensitive sometimes than even me, but he's not afraid to speak his truth. And I remember just as a child seeing him do that, the evolution with him, and just thinking, wow, now that's, it takes courage to do that. It's obviously different now because we have social media. I'm sure you get it. I get it in terms of you get a lot of online trolls and abuse. But I think just having that character definitely played a part in terms of what I do now.
Well, you've certainly spoken out in favour of the British, I guess, Commonwealth, you'd say, maybe not empire. But perhaps we'll have time to get into that in this conversation. I'd be curious to get your opinion on it. But can we talk about two-tier Britain, which we hear so much about and which you've spoken a lot about? There's a sort of surface level phenomena. I want to understand whether you think it's real. There's a feeling of a two-tier Britain, or like how is there substance beneath it? Is there justification in saying that this country is two-tiered? And then maybe we'll look at some of the root causes of that. Starting that, I mentioned already Hugh Edwards. Now, this sentencing has upset a lot of people, not least because we're coming out of the back of the English riots, where most famous example would be the Facebook meme story. I don't know if you saw this guy, Richard Williams in Wales, who has been sentenced to 3 months in prison for a racist meme on Facebook, and that was deemed inciting violence. So there's a sense of different standards being applied. Hugh Edwards, of course, the most highly paid BBC broadcaster, at least until 2024. I want to know what your take on it is, whether you think there is two-tier system in this country.
I think Hugh Edwards is the best example of the fact that there is a two-tier system in this country. I think it goes beyond just policing. I think you look at it in media, institutions, education. It's beyond just, I think, we saw the riots in terms of the two-tier policing there, but I think it goes a lot deeper. When you see the sentence Hugh Edwards got, I mean, it's pretty disgraceful, and I think it's horrific in terms of what that says to the rest of this country in terms of what we put value for in crime. We value or we put higher importance on a crime of a social media post versus somebody who's got indecent pictures of children. And I think that's deeply concerning. I think if you ask the vast majority of this country, I think that they would be extremely hurt and I think annoyed. And I just think there is a real sense of the people in significant power positions in this country being completely out of touch with the vast majority of this country. I think they've lost any sort of understanding of what people care about. They're very quick to throw the far right at any situation that they can. And I really think I know we're here in London today, but I think this is a serious London problem. And I think we have these positions of power. These people are in London, based in London. And I think this sort of London standard is being applied to the rest of the country in terms of what Londoners value the most and what they think the most. I think it's a problem in America, in New York, Washington, Sydney. I think big cities naturally are going to be a bit more liberal, naturally are a bit more wealthier, naturally don't have the same problems or concerns the everyday person does. And I think, unfortunately, people are choosing to ignore the working class people of this country. And I would actually go as far now, as we're seeing with some things you mentioned there, they're actually showing almost like a hatred towards them. And I think that's fueling this two-tier system, because I have no doubt, following like Hugh Edwards, following what we saw in the riots, we're beyond just two-tier policing. I think it's much deeper in this country.
So YouGov published their polling, which suggests that 45% of Britons actually think that the sentences of the rioters, the English rioters, was about right.
Right. So
you say it's a London thing,
yeah.
Which I'm guilty of saying similar things. That there's a sort of there's the Westminster bubble, the establishment bubble, liberal elite type thing, and you're alluding to that. Yeah. Americans have the similar sort of split. But if this sort of suggests that the Britain is cleaved slightly differently, like there's a different split there. Do you think that that's how does that fit into your thesis? I just don't.
The problem with the polling in this country, and again, it's like sample size, right? The sample size is typically very short. It's typically done in around big cities. It's not. These pollings aren't necessarily always being done in Devon or in places of Newcastle or places outside of the big cities. And the other thing is, I don't want to allude to the rights, but there is a lot of people who are scared to voice what they're feeling or saying. It is a lot more socially acceptable to be agreeing with the higher powers of this country than it is to go against. You will have seen it. I will have seen it. Anyone that has will see the enormous backlash you get straight away. And unless you're somebody with extreme amounts of courage or extreme amounts of patriotism, you're unlikely going to do it. Like, you're unlikely going to put yourself out on a limb where you can get ostracized by society to make a big statement or to make any sort of, just talk about your feelings in terms of what's going on in this country. So I think people are scared to actually voice what they're thinking and what they're saying. And I think too many times what the sort of liberal elites establishment will do is they'll focus on the fringes of people who don't necessarily articulate the points maybe as well as you or me, or people who are not necessarily the best examples of the stuff we're talking about, and they'll latch onto that, and that becomes the conversation about far rightness, for example, as opposed to sitting there and saying, well, the majority of this country voted Brexit. 80% of this country didn't vote for the current government. Maybe we should ask some questions. Maybe we should dig a bit deeper and try and find out why that's the case. There's clearly, those riots happened for a reason. We shouldn't, obviously, we should condemn all the ones doing it, like, that were being violent on either side. But at the same time, why are people so frustrated in this country? Why are they so angry? Why are they so disattached from this government, whether it's Tories, Labour, whatever? And I don't think anyone wants to ask that question.
Okay, well, let's ask it. What's your answer to that question?
I think the answer to that question is, for too long in this country, we have looked down on terms of the working class. I think what's changed is we're so separated from big city versus rural parts of this country. I think there's no one is willing to take that plunge of actually sitting there and thinking, what is the everyday person's concern? And I think there's quite a few things that have built up towards this. So I think political correctness, wokeness from the last 10, 15 years has now infiltrated to a much almost wider spread disease, if you like. It's come into all of our institutions. And I think the reason for that is because there's a lot of people in this country in these senior positions that will look towards a sense of purpose. We hear it all the time right now, in terms of what is your purpose in life? What are you trying to do? And I think we've moved away from the purpose being maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is get a job, try to get educated if you have the resources to, aspire to be a good son, daughter, father, one day mother, husband, wife. I think we've moved away from some of those basic, almost the basic structure of society. And I think now what we've decided to do is say, let's find something or a cause that we don't actually really fully understand, whether it's climate change, whether it's BLM, whether it's attacking the far right, whether it's the trans community. And we've decided that that's going to be our purpose. And it makes me such a good person to post a pride picture or BLM or Palestine or whatever the trendy thing is, rather than doing the hard thing, which is saying, I'm actually going to go and try to provide for my family. I'm going to one day try to be a father. I'm going to one day try to be a mother. And to do that, I'm going to actually have to work hard. I'm actually going to have to get out my bubble. And I'm actually going to have to do the tough choices that a lot of our parents would have had to do, and that generation. And I think people are finding purpose in these virtue signaling things, because that gives them the instant gratification straight away. Doing what I've just said it's not easy. It's very hard. Like, I don't think there's a father out there, a mother out there that can say they did 100% the best job in the world. I think they would all say that they made their mistakes, but that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that's one of the reasons, jumping topic, we're seeing a declining birth rate in the UK amongst pretty much every ethnic group. And I think that's a big part of it. Part of it.
What do you think? Where has that malaise come from? Why is it that is it from the decline in religion? Do you think it's because of is it a consequence of immigration and different types of people coming to Britain, or is it deeper in our culture? You mentioned earlier education. Is this fundamental to a failure of schooling, or where do you think this comes from specifically?
I think it's definitely a combination of those few things. Religion's an interesting one because, I'm not going to profess to be the most religious person in the world, but I do sometimes now think about the consequences of us becoming more and more away from religion, becoming more and more secular. And I think one of the bad impacts of that is there's a lack of structure in a lot of people's lives. And again, you could take it further and say we're seeing a rise of people being born in single-parent households. And again, I'm not advocating people to stay in abusive relationships or you have to get married before you have a child. But fathers not being present is a massive problem in this country. And I think that's having a really adverse impact on the next generation. And I think there's a lack of responsibility there. So I think religion's definitely played a part. I think education's played a part. We're now focused more on teaching tolerance and PC-ness rather than actually making our kids the brightest kids and the smartest kids that they are. I think there was a stat recently I saw that the number one thing that people in America and the UK want to be, if you ask a child, is an influencer. And in China, it's an astronaut. And so,
we're so doomed.
Yeah. So there is, I just think there's so much of the breakdown in our society. And I think a lot of it is, it's one thing saying you're anti-establishment. It's one thing saying, you want to change the system and you're not happy with the way it is. But that's often having a solution. If you don't have a solution to changing a lot of the long-standing institutions or structures we have, you're an anarchist. You're not anti-establishment. And I think a lot of people have gone in with that mentality. And I think it's a privileged few that are making the rules for the rest of the country, for the vast majority. And I think it's inadvertently hurting the vast sets of this country. Going back onto education, the group of people who are suffering the most or are in the greatest decline are British white boys. So the numeracy rates, the literacy rates are all declining for British white boys. Now, I'm not British white, but that is absolutely terrible for somebody like me, because the reality is the majority of this country, as much as mainstream media won't show this, is white. More than 80% of this country is white. So the majority of the workforce is white. And the gender that's going to be most in the workforce is men. Obviously we can't have kids. So the majority of the time men are going to be working for a much longer period than women will be. So if the declining of these boys in terms of their education standards, in terms of their productivity standards is happening now, then the workforce in this country is going to suffer. So it doesn't matter what race you are, black, white, brown, you're going to be in a country whose productivity is going to be on the decline. But this will never be talked about. It will never be addressed. Instead, we'll talk about everything else, BLM, whatever. But if we really wanted to focus on a race of people that are struggling right now in this country, I think it would make sense to do it to one of the largest portions of people in this country and trying to improve their standards. Now, I don't think really it should be about race at all, whether you're white, black or brown. I think there's deep issues. I think, like I alluded to, the single parent households is having a massive impact. I think with boys, we celebrate the more feminine they are, and rather than tolerating or accepting the fact that men are going to be men, and that's not an excuse for some of the bad stuff that men do, but by suppressing it, I think you make it far worse. I think you increase the chance of them being physical. We've seen it, the stats of boys are more likely to become violent in their adult life when they don't have a father figure, when they've not been taught to manage their rage and their anger. And in a culture now and an education system now where we celebrate them being more feminine, we almost want them to be and try push them to be. I think when it gets to later life, that's really, really terrible, and I think has a massively negative impact on them. So I think the breakdown in terms of the West, not just UK, but even America and even parts of Europe, has it's I think there's quite a few folds to it, and I just think not many people are prepared to address it because it's a difficult conversation.
We're seeing the feminization of men in America, I think, far more apparent, and obvious examples will be, let's say, Kamala Harris's husband Doug Emhoff and Tim Walz, basically beta men. And even at the DNC, the commentators were explicit. Dana Bash was explicit in saying we need to appeal to low T men. She literally said that. So and we have that same sort of culture here in Britain where being masculine, being male, having testosterone, high testosterone is frowned upon, and we're trying to bring down men, and that seems to be a sort of Western wide problem. which we're certainly suffering from here in Britain. I'm not sure. Where do you think that's come from? Is that sort of a postmodern philosophical way of bringing down the whole of society?
I think it's a breakdown of the family household. I think that's definitely had an impact. I think fathers not being present has had an impact. I think it's, again, a very privileged few women in power who have decided to take on this agenda. And there's no doubt, look, men and women equality, if we go back 50 years ago, was something that should have been improved. And we know that there was mistakes made. But to now use those arguments today is absurd. Like, it makes absolute no sense. And I think, we saw even under a Conservative government recently with the MPs talking about sort of Andrew Tate and, he shouldn't be taught at schools. And,
Andrew Tate shouldn't be taught at school.
Not taught at schools, but they...
Because I happen to agree that he should not be taught at schools.
It was, I think they were... they were banning children from watching his video or something along those lines. It got brought up in Parliament about Andrew Tate was brought up in a school environment. Look, there's no way we should sit here and talk about Andrew Tate as much as we do. And I think the reality is, the question that they should have been asking, the MPs, and they should have been asking is, why are people following this man? Why are a group of boys, typically teenagers, so disillusioned that they're having to follow a social media person online? And the reason is to have a breakdown in their own households. They don't know where else to see masculinity. So that to them is masculinity, and that's what it should be. Now, there's good parts, bad parts, but if you don't have it in your own household, you're going to try and find it somewhere else. And I don't think necessarily that's always the best place. And I think it opens a much more dangerous society. And I think in a longer term period, I think it's really detrimental. And I think that's something that I wish more people would talk about in this country, is the impact on young boys in this country in terms of what they're going through. Because I think, especially as I mentioned, British white boys, I think the culture that they're being brought up in is not one that's favourable at all to them.
That's not something that can be easily changed with politics, though, because it's more fundamental. That goes back to the earlier conversation of religion, I think, and the secularization of a society. The family structure. Do you think that policy can really encourage the rebuilding of the British family?
I think it can. It's not going to be like a dictatorial way of doing it, but I think at schools, for example, I think maybe we should be empowering teachers to talk about the impacts of a father's role, a mother's role, regardless of your religion or belief. I think that could be done, and I think that's a soft, easier way of doing it. Teaching that the reality is that women most likely will reproduce, and that will mean they'll be outside of the workforce for a certain period of time. And I think that could definitely be taught on a school level. I think you could, you could encourage one of the big things on BLM. One of the big things that I was really so against the organization wasn't necessarily the idea of everyone's equal and everyone is the same and all this sort of stuff. Is BLM was a political organization. If you go on their website, they had a manifesto, and one of the things in their manifesto was the destruction of a nuclear family, so a traditional mum-dad environment. Now, we don't know, the impact of two men having a child or two women having a child. There's not really been enough data. Gay couples haven't had access to children for a very long time in terms of adopting children. So looking at that data, it's quite difficult to really sit and make assessments in terms of they have to have a mother, they have to have a father, all this sort of stuff. But we know for a fact, any example, when you're in a two-parent household, you're going to be more successful. Now, there's anomalies and stuff. You're 4 times less likely to get into poverty. You're 5 times less likely to go to jail. It doesn't matter if you're in the UK, India, Brazil, wherever. If you have 2 parents, you're going to be. That doesn't mean they have
two male-female parents.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if they've necessarily live together. It doesn't necessarily, they don't have to be married. If you have a present father, a present mother in your life, you're going to, more likely than not, you'll be successful. You've got a greater chance to be successful.
The statistics are worse still, actually. This is a little bit complicated, but if you only have a single parent, if you're the only single parent that you have is a father rather than a mother, you will also do better than if you're a mother, which is makes things a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the riots, if I may, if I can. I want to go back to the issue of Islam, because there was obviously a lot of targeting of mosques, and there was a case. This seems to have started with a bit of mis or disinformation spread online from now it was been established it was a Pakistani news outlet or journalist called Mr. Asif, Farhan Asif, and Channel 3 now. He says he didn't make it up, but that he certainly was the source of this information, and that led to a lot of the rioters targeting mosques, even though the Southport killing, which was the root of that whole incident, didn't have anything to do with Islam. You might argue it had something to do with immigration, but you can't say it had anything to do with Islam. You've spoken out, you've talked about Islam publicly. I wondered how you made sense of this, or my take was that there was a feeling, because of a build-up of problems between Muslim communities in Britain and non-Muslim communities in Britain, be they Sikh or Christian, over 20, 30 years, that sort of spilled out after Southport. That was sort of my take on it. And I wondered how you made sense of that, and whether what that feeling in the air was that seemed to have the Southport killing seemed to have fit into.
I think that's exactly it. Southport wasn't the root cause, but I see it almost like the catalyst. I think it was a lot of frustration within the majority of this country in terms of how you adapt Islam into the West. It's a battle for generally the West in general in terms of how you adapt the Islamic culture into the West. I would argue maybe 10, maybe more years, this has not really been a massive issue, because the demographic has always been hasn't changed as much as it's changed in the last 10 years. So I know we talk about net migration in terms of it's over 100,000, but the reality is that's people coming in and leaving. And so,
net migration is more than 100,000.
More than 100,000.
600,000.
Yeah. So when you look at those figures, that's people leaving and coming in, and that is a lot of white Brits leaving this country to go to Australia, to go to different parts. So the demographic in this country is changing quite drastically.
Right.
And I think...
to fill it in, gross emigration is 1.2 million. Gross migration is 1.2 million, but we're losing something like 600,000. So the 600,000 figure of net migration positive doesn't actually tell the whole story. I think this is the point you're making. That's what I'm trying to say, we're actually, the demographics of Britain are changing quite drastically.
And they're changing very fast and at a rapid rate. And I think we've not really sat here and had a discussion, and I don't think many of the politicians or the people in power have sat there and said, what is the impact of this? What does this mean for our country? What does this mean? And I think we should have looked at countries in Europe who took large groups of refugees from Sweden, in Scandinavian countries, and we should have looked at that and thought, okay, they've had some serious problems post that. We've seen in terms of the level of sexual assaults that go on in these countries skyrocket. We've seen violence skyrocket in these countries. We've seen grooming gangs become more of a popular thing in Scandinavian countries. So I don't think we've actually sat there and thought, what are the implications? I think we've been so scared to have this discussion in terms of what the impact's going to be, that we're now trying to move away from it as much as we can, because it's awkward and it's not necessarily a nice conversation. Prior to 10, 15 years ago, we never really had this issue, because the Islamic community were almost not forced to adapt, just like any community. Hindus, when my parents came to this country in the 70s, 80s, whenever groups have come to this country, you adapt. This is your country, you adapt to Britain. There's not large groups of people necessarily in certain ghettos or certain areas in terms of this country. It's fairly spread out, so you don't actually really allow for a massive change in British values and British culture. And a lot of people that came in, I'd say the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, I think they came to be a part of Britain. They saw the opportunity that this is actually, this is going to be better for our lives. We want to, we agree with the British value, largely Judeo-Christian values in the West, and we want to be a part of it, and we want to our children to be a part of it, and they're going to really encompass the British culture. That is not the case now for the population of people coming into this country. We know for a fact some of them are just seeking pure refuge. Some of them are taking advantage whether it comes to the benefit structure. Some people now come into this country on, not some, I think there's actually large sums of people that come to this country that actually have a genuine hatred towards Western values and Western culture.
Hatred?
Yeah, I don't know how else you could describe it. You see some of the riots or protests that we see on a regular basis. We've seen the abuse that the Jewish community has got in the last year. Well, it's been going on for longer than a year, but in particular since October 7th last year. There is a complete unwillingness to try to adapt to the Western culture, and we in Britain, I think, have done a terrible job in terms of making those values clear and actually standing up for them. And I think that's why it's often going to be people like myself who are a different skin color who will have the courage to say something like this, because I think if you speak to the majority of Brits, regardless of skin color, they would all want to see our British values be protected and our culture.
Okay, this is great, because this is actually something that I've tried to have this conversation on the show a few times. Everyone has a different answer when you ask them, what are British values? What does it mean to be Britain? And this is actually fundamental, I think, to this country and to the problems we're facing right now. We need to all agree on what the answer to the question is. What is it to be British? What is it that unites us all? And what is the shared culture that we can all live together with, that will create social cohesion? What's the answer to that question?
Democracy. I think that's always the first thing that comes.
Well, America has democracy, so
yeah, democracy. I'd start with there. I'd start with the fact that in this country, merit. I think we're people don't give us enough credit for the fact that in this country, we're in a single generation. You can go from being relatively poor to working class to middle class to upper class. You can do that in Britain. I'd argue it's harder now than maybe it was 10, 15 years ago, but it's still possible. And that's based on merit. And that is incredible. It's beautiful. We take that for a given, I think, in the West, because you go across the country, it's not like that, across the world, sorry, it's not like that. The impact of where you're born has a massive, massive upbearing in terms of what you can become, whether it's a caste system, whether it's just a general social society that you come from. So that's another big part. I think that one is really, the one that you'll probably see a lot of immigrants or product of immigrants most frustrated and annoyed about, because a lot of those people would have come here on the basis of that idea of merit, and you can be what you want depending on how hard you work and all that sort of stuff. And when you see that getting diminished, I think that's a bit of a problem. I think another part of Britain is the Judeo-Christian values. We are a country we may not necessarily be classified a Christian country, but there are basic structures in this country. You
don't think we're a Christian country?
I think it's hard to now, in 2024, to say to any country that they are a Christian country, a Hindu country, or whatever. I would say that we are definitely a country that's come from Judeo-Christian values. Definitely. I think the structure of this country, the way it's been done, is largely on that basis.
But we're no longer a Christian country. Do you ever think we were a Christian country?
I don't think we, in terms of, if you look at now the amount of atheists we have and people that don't believe in religion full stop, forget about Christianity, I don't think we can really call ourselves a Christian country. I think we're probably past that stage.
I'll make the case for it then.
Okay.
Right? Because I would agree that we are, according to the last census, we are a minority. Christians are a minority in Britain. However, even our most prominent atheists, like Richard Dawkins, will say he's a cultural Christian.
Right.
And I would say that all our traditions, all our culture are Christian. Our
Agreed.
Flag is the cross of St. George,
Yeah.
St. Andrew's cross. The Union flag is 3 Christian crosses.
Yeah.
The king has a mandate from God. Well, mandate was the wrong term there, but he's ordained by God. Well, is that even the right term? I've probably got that wrong. But he is the head of the church, the national church. It is a Christian church, and I would say that it was founded by King Alfred the Great, a Christian king. He wrote his Doom book. The foundations of the common law, foundations of our legal system come from the Ten Commandments. And we've marinated in 1,200 years of Christian thought specifically.
Yeah.
Now, I agree it's Judeo-Christian because the Ten Commandments obviously brings in the Jewish aspect, but I do think we are a Christian country, even if we're a minority. Christians are a minority in this country. And then if you reject that it's a Christian country, then what exactly, how exactly does one tie the fundamentals? If you don't, let's say you reject Judeo-Christianity and you reject even that we are culturally Christian, does that mean that non-culturally Christian people are just as British as culturally Christian people? Well, that's a very tricky question to answer because there's lots of people, like you say your Hindu background.
Yeah.
How does a Hindu fit into that? That's maybe why there's a tension, there's a complication for Britain.
I would definitely agree with the foundation of this country is Christian. I'd say right now it's not a Christian country. I'd happily take the notion that that's what it should be. I think it'd solve a lot more problems than it would cause. And I think the principles of everything you said is factually correct. So there's nothing to really disagree there. I just think right now, in terms of the way the population is, the way our political structure is, it's no longer a Christian country. I think that would probably go all those things I've talked about in terms of whether it's education, in terms of talking about what it means to be British, in terms of these culture wars, in terms of all these clashes. I think a lot of them would be solved if we went back to the notion that it's a Christian country, Christian values, Judeo-Christian structure that's come into this country, and then we work from there. And I think if that was such a problem, then why has Britain for such a long period of time been one of the most welcoming places for immigrants? Why has it been that in this country immigrants are able to be just as successful as the natives or people that were born here? I think there's a clear structure where it fits. There's a reason why people have come from all over the world to be here, and there's a reason why we have such a diverse population. I think now we have rejected all the Judeo-Christian values in this country. Forget about even thinking it's a Christian country. I think we're beyond that now. I think we're just rejecting anything that's Judeo-Christian, and I think we're now
certainly the Westminster bubble.
The Westminster
rejected
bubble.
It.
It's
multiculturalism.
So that's now the new rule or whatever you want to call it. And I just think now it's so dangerous. It's so divisive. It's more divisive than it is inclusive, which is what they're trying to do. I think there's just, again, a lack of thought that's gone into this.
Yeah, so I'm trying to get to the bottom of the answer is what is it that unites us all? Now, if I can go back to your earlier one, democracy, merit and Judeo-Christian values. But that doesn't actually differentiate us from any other Western country because they all have those.
I would argue if we did that, if we adopted that tomorrow, we'd be different to all the West right now. Because I don't think many Western countries, if any, are accepting those values. And I think that's why we're seeing the West in this sort of chaotic era that it's going through. I think if you look at across Europe, I think if you look across in America, I think that divide's probably even bigger than it is here. You look at Canada, I don't see any country right now that is prepared to take this on board. There are people for sure in other countries that are trying to do this. I think there's a really good the Conservative Party leader in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, I think is incredible. He's definitely trying to adopt many of these things. But I think now it's almost like a back to basics thing that I think we need to do. And I think that kind of list is a good starting place. I think there needs to be a lot more conversations about the rest in terms of how do we get large portions of the people in this country to adopt these British values, or how do we get them to stop to feel the need to adapt? Because I just feel now, and I think a lot of Brits will feel that there is a real divide in terms of the native versus non-native population. And I don't think that was the case 15, 20 years ago. I think it's definitely a newer problem.
That's been exacerbated by mass migration and an inability to have this conversation about how
Definitely.
So when you say your parents' generation came here, and I like that you used the word adapted, because we hear a lot of integration, but I like the word adapted. How do you think he would have articulated the values in which he was adapting to, just as you've done them?
Yeah, pretty much. I think the big thing would have been merit. Like, yeah, I just think we really take this for granted where, you can come to this country and then next to nothing. And as long as you apply yourself, and it doesn't matter if you're man, woman, black, brown, white, whatever, you work hard. You try to get educated, or you do the best of what you can. You save money, and you can move up in this.
So you don't think the people who are moving to Britain right now,
I don't think they all
believe
come
in
with
merit?
I don't think they all come with that ideology. I think they come as for a safe haven, which you could argue the superpowers, the great powers of this world should take in the portion or whatever. But I think it's now beyond that. I think they come here and they also know that the demographic is changing. You can now come here and be within your community, part of this country, and basically have no attachment to anything we've just said. In terms of the British values, you can come to certain parts of the country, or it's Bradford, parts of Birmingham, London, and basically not have to talk about any of the stuff that we've mentioned here, and zero adaptation need, or very little adaptation need. And there's a reason why people can't speak English in this country, which is like crazy when you think about how far we've gone.
Language should be on the list, right?
Well, there we go. Yeah,
speaking English should be part of
I think that should be, part of the remit to come here. But again, there's just it feels like a real disdain towards the West. And I get it if you're not from the West, and it makes sense because it's different. But if you're coming to the West, I think there should be a sort of general appreciation for the culture you're coming into. And I don't know if it's, I think it's actually easier for somebody like me, in terms of with not me personally, my parents' immigrant background, so you can kind of see how fortunate you are to be in this amazing country, how fortunate these values are, and if you take them for granted, what can happen? I think it takes not enough, maybe the majority of Brits are necessarily articulating this well enough, or even having the courage to speak about it, because they feel the backlash. And I completely get it, that you would face, especially if you're a white person saying some stuff I've said. I think I think the vocabulary for the average white person is very small compared to a non-white person. But I think if people don't speak about this, if we don't have these open conversations, then I think it's going to do is going to leave the few that do will be branded as racist, far-right bigots and stuff. But I think there's a serious conversation that needs to be had, and I think few people are prepared to talk about it.
One thing which it goes around my head, and I don't quite know how it fits in, but I do believe that the English have a history, and I do think that that's quite an important part of it. And one would have no qualms about saying that the Jewish people have a history. They have a book which documents that history. I actually think we have a history, but not a book, and it goes back at least 1,200 years to the founding of this country. But we can't really talk about that, because then you get into an awkward puzzle about people. How do people fit in if they don't have any direct link to that history? But I think you can still be part of it. I think you can come into that history and take it on as your own. My mother's an example. She has no French blood whatsoever. But you meet her, she's entirely French.
Right.
And so she's adopted, she couldn't be any other culture at all, but she's completely, I think it is possible to take on the software of a people when you come into it. And I do think that's part of...
Well, you can appreciate it more, right? Because you see what life could have been like, or you see different things. So you have this natural appreciation. You have a massive appreciation because you really, you won't take it for granted. You understand what life, like I said, could have been like. So I think you have a greater appreciation at times, and it becomes a bit easier to articulate because you can have a bit more of an honest and frank conversation. I just think it's really tough at the moment for a British white person to come on a platform like this or on any TV thing, say, I'm really proud to be British. I'm really proud of our history. I'm really proud of our heritage, and I want to defend that. I think for somebody to do that, I think it takes a lot of courage in 2024, which it should not be the case. That should not be the standard that we now look at. And I think that's part of the big issue here.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Did you see the story? This is from September 13th, the Grooming gang sentences, where we had a total of 106 years of jail time for offences against 2 Rotherham girls, against 7 offenders. You've spoken out about the grooming gangs. This is a very specific to one demographic, it seems. Not some people are quick to say it's a Muslim problem. I actually don't think it is. It's more specific still. It's to a specific region within Pakistan that this has come to Britain, and it's obviously a huge point of contention, and I do believe linked to the riots we saw after Southport. I think that this is the thing that's fueled a lot of the anger, partly because it's, well, maybe apart from the obvious how atrocious this story is. For decades and decades, tens of thousands of girls have been groomed by men and raped and in some cases murdered. But there's also a sense that there's a two-tier, or there has been no justice for the girls. The media, it completely ignored it. This story from the September 13th, GB News was the only, and Charlie Peters, the journalist there, was the only one to report on the sentencing. Even now, the mainstream media are terrified to talk about it. It's like it's too absolutely taboo. What's your impression on the grooming gangs issue? Why is it so taboo for us to talk about it? And what can we do about it to end it?
The Rotherham, again, we were talking earlier about two-tier. I think if you ever want like evidence again of two-tier, this is, like case study number one. Like this is absolutely absurd. Like it's gone on for, like you said, more than 10 years. Police have actually acknowledged in their report they didn't want to stoke racial tension as a means to why they didn't properly investigate this and bring justice to it. So it's in writing. It's there for us to see, and it's like absolutely disgraceful that no media outlet aside from GB News had the courage to even report this. This is any other example of where this happened. If this was a group of British white men who formed a gang, a grooming gang, and attacked hundreds of women over a sustained period of time, it would rightly be on every news channel and we'd be talking about it, and that would be, there'd probably be an investigation to the police, we'd probably have education training amongst schools, amongst adults, blah blah, we'd be talking about this for a long time, rightly so, but we're not doing about this because the reality is people are too afraid to talk about anything against the British Pakistani community, because straight away you're going to be labelled Islamophobic. It's not worth the risk or worth the potential damage to your reputation, to your career, to general society. So we're just going to ignore it and we're going to push it under the carpet. But what happens when you do that is, I'm not trying to justify the people who were inciting violence or doing violent things on the riots, but that's a product of when you suppress people and they feel so lost and they feel so angry, they take out in the wrong way. They do not the right things or the right measures of protest. And I think this is a perfect example of it. And unless people can really speak about this, I think it's something that's not going to change. And again, back to the sort of London big city argument is this doesn't affect a lot of people, right? This doesn't affect people in the Westminster bubble. This isn't something that's not on their priority list because it's never going to happen to them. It's never going to happen to their children. It's not going to affect them. So what they're affected by is climate change. What they're affected by is BLM. They're affected by...
I don't even think they're affected by climate change. I think it's just a fashionable thing for them to say they're affected by it.
It's a fashionable thing to say, and they're creating things, if you like, these socially trendy things that they should talk about. But serious things that affect huge populations of this country will be completely ignored. And I think this is a great example. And I think you've rightly said it there, which not enough people do, in terms of specifying the exact community. I've seen so many times British Asians when we talk about the grooming gang scandals, or talk about Muslims in general and all this sort of stuff. It's not fair. It's clearly one community that's done this. And I think that should be the lead headline when we do talk about this, because that is, it's clearly an issue. I think the bigger issue is what we talked about earlier, is when you bring a large population of people and you put them into one area into part of this country, and they don't have to adapt to any of the Western cultures, any of the Western values, then they start to do practices that in this country are illegal, but they'll still do them because they don't actually understand or have any need to understand what happens when you don't. And I think that's the really frightening and scary thing. I'm worried about, this has obviously been reported and we've got this news, but like what else is going on in other parts of this country? Because as you rightfully said, aside from GB News, no one even reported it. So what's going on? If you're a young girl who's been assaulted in the last few years or whatever, would you have the courage to speak about it now, knowing if it was done by a brown-skinned person, knowing the implications of how long it took for those people to get justice? Is it worth the hassle? Is it worth the aggro? Is it worth being called racist or whatever? And I think that's really horrible.
Do you think that this, or rather, why do you think it is that this problem comes from this community?
Honestly, I don't know if it's a cultural. I don't know. I think
you've come out on Twitter and in media and said some pretty stirring, provocative things about the British Pakistani community.
I wouldn't say stirring. I would say they're all factual.
Well, you've said they might be factual, but these are provocative statistics. Look,
if they're provocative. These are stats.
It's believed that 70% of Muslim women are unemployed versus 27% of Christian women.
That one is interesting because it stirred up, of all the stats I shared, that seemed to annoy people the most. But
why did that annoy people?
Because I think the unemployment rate for the Muslim community is actually less for women. But it's not. I'm not talking about the unemployment rate. I'm talking about the same for Christians. It's less than 27% Christian women. I'm talking about people who are not in work. So they're physically not working. So of course there is going to be a fairly substantial population of people that are pregnant or have a child and they can't physically work, or they're looking after their child. So that's why I deliberately wanted to share the Christian women example of it, just to give a fairness to it, so it doesn't seem like the figures being, what's the word? I've made it bigger than it actually seems, or it's bigger. So I wanted to share because Christian women go through that same difficulty as well, of having children and trying to balance work and their child. But that one seemed to have stirred the most emotion because the unemployment rate for Muslim women is considerably less. But to be on the unemployment rate, you have to be wanting to get a job. You have to go out there and actually, sign up to the universal credit. And so a lot aren't actually doing that because they don't seem to need to, or whatever the motive is. But again, these are, we can go through the stats again, but these are factual stats. And I think, whether they're provocative or not is irrelevant. I think we should have a discussion about it. And I think we should, speak to that community because it is becoming a much bigger thing. I truly believe it's in the last 15 to 20 years because of the change in the demographic of this country. I think if you go back prior to that, I don't think it's nowhere near as much of an issue because just by nature, they're adapting more. They're in, regardless of your religion, you're going to adapt. And when you're the minority in a country, you're going to adapt more. When you have to, you don't almost have to not adapt, which is what they don't have to do now in populations of those countries. So I think we need to talk about the fact, the women's situation. I think we definitely need to talk about that. I think we need to talk about the fact with why cousin marriages are not banned when we know for a fact that they have a child from that from a cousin marriage has a much likelier chance of having a birthing defect. I think that's
you've written that
horrific on children.
55% of British Pakistanis are married to some sort of relative, and that between 2007 and 2011, 37% of British Pakistani marriages in Bradford were to first cousins. So that's a cultural.
For sure.
A big cultural thing.
The BBC did an amazing documentary about this 10, 15 years ago. And there's one on Netflix right now about this. They will never do this production now, of course. But the one where I actually started learning anything about this was from the BBC. Of course, they would not do that now. But, you can watch a BBC documentary about the impact of cousin marriages. And it's honestly, when you watch it, it's horrible because you see the children who are the ones who get punished through no fault of their own. And rightly so, they brought attention to it. Unfortunately, the government, senior powers, whatever you want to call it, did not do enough to protect these children and future children. And now we have this crisis that we're talking about with these children being born. And I think it's a cultural issue. Why it's a cultural issue, where it comes from, I'm not British Pakistani, so I wouldn't be the best person to say it, but I think we should acknowledge it, whether it's provocative or whether it's stirring or whatever. These are facts that have happened in this country, and like any other statistic, like any other fact, when it is a bad one or a worrying one, we should probably try and do something about it. And I just think right now we're not going to do anything about it because people are going to be too afraid to talk about it. And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah. Well, you certainly aren't afraid, which is, I hope that more people find the courage to talk about these difficult issues. We mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about immigration. Sir Keir Starmer binned the Rwanda plan straight away. He has just spoken to Giorgia Meloni in Italy. He's come back from a deal here. He said he's going to give £4 million a year to Italy to help with their Albanian plan, which is that immigrants will be to Italy, or illegal immigrants to Italy will be sent to be processed in Albania. And they're Sir Keir apparently is looking at that system and likes that system. What do you think should be done for Britain, given the scale? Since Sir Keir came to power, we've had 10,000 illegal immigrants come across the channel. What do you think is the correct approach to dealing with this issue?
I think rhetoric is the first and foremost is so important. And there's a really good example of this in America in the last election. So just on the switching of power from Trump to Biden in 2020, January, we saw in America the amount of people coming into the country illegally went up by more than, I think, 200%, or I think it's close to like 600%. Just because the rhetoric obviously is going to change, right? When you have somebody like Trump who's so out there in the way he speaks and is quite brutally honest, it deterred people from essentially coming, right? You're less likely to come to a country when you have a leader saying, if you come to this country illegally, I'm going to send you back, and there's going to be strong consequences. I think the first thing Sir Keir or any leader of this country should do with this crisis is start with that approach as a if you're sitting there saying, I'm going to welcome you with open hands, and you know what, we're going to process you in the right, correct way, and we're going to take our time with it. We want to be as human as possible, and, all this sort of stuff. Is that really going to deter you from coming into this country illegally? No, I think it needs a much tougher stance on it. The Italian Prime Minister is a great example of this, right? I guarantee the reason they're processing less. Yes, the Albanian plan, I'm sure, works terrifically, but her stance is, I guarantee, had an impact for the reason why people are not coming into Italy as much. If you look at so many of her past clips, even before she came into power, some of the stuff she was talking about, the impact of mass migration in Italy, some stuff we've been talking about now, I think that would have naturally had a deterrence for people to come in the first place. So I think that has a much bigger impact than people think. And I think the last American election is a good example of that. So I think that'd be a good starting point.
Well, on that then, what's interesting is that the politician that is most vocal about the immigration problem, or the illegal immigration problem, Nigel Farage of Reform UK, has said that he said this in a recent interview with Steve Edgington at GB News, that there is no political appetite to talk about mass deportation or deportation. So the one politician who is supposedly fearless when it comes to talking about this doesn't really want to engage in the conversation about deportation. What does that tell us about the rhetoric of Britain?
I think it probably tells you within the last month or so since he's been in Westminster, I think he probably realises how the real battle he's up against in terms of the likelihood of that happening. When you have conservative-leaning people afraid to talk about this conversation, when you have the people who are supposed to be the ones being most firm in terms of border control, not prepared to have these conversations, I think that kind of sums up his rhetoric and why he said what he said. So I'm not that surprised in terms of the way he said what he said. I think he also, there's probably a much realizing it's actually a lot more difficult than we maybe thought it would be. I think it starts from border control probably having more people, more staff in the first place. I think it means we as a country have to take a lot more serious than we have. I think it means spending huge sums of money on deportations, on just generally on immigration. And I think when you look at that scale and you already look at that, it's not really a thing to really talk about. And you look at the economic impact it'd probably have. I think people will just shy away from it and do what Sakir's done, which is say, "Oh, Italy, you're doing amazing. Please tell us how we can do better." And I'm taking it seriously, but with no actual policy in place for how he's going to stop this, because I think we're realizing it's a lot more difficult than we thought. And that's why, again, I think it goes back to the point I was saying about rhetoric, but even further than that, about having strong principles and conviction in what you believe in. And I think few of them have that. So how can they then relay that into policy or anything like that when the popular opinion, or what YouGov or Twitter or social media will say, is you're doing something that's deeply unpopular? Will they have the courage to really stand there and make really tough political decisions when I would argue, I still think the majority of this country would want a much tougher stance on immigration, but maybe the polling or maybe social media says something different. So would a leader or whoever who doesn't necessarily have the strongest principles and morals, would he be able to act on this? Is he going to act on it? I think the answer probably is a no, and I think that's where we're at, to be honest.
Okay, so what do you think 5 years of Labour is going to leave us?
I think trying to be as optimistic as possible.
Give us the most optimistic take.
I mean, the amount of damage he's done in the last, 60 odd days, I don't think that will carry on as bad as it is. I think it would definitely, I just don't see how our economy is going to improve remotely. And I think that should be the first and foremost people should look at. And I don't think that's going to improve. I think we're going to start to focus on more and more things that are just not important to the everyday Brit. And we're seeing that already. We saw that with the foreign aid towards the climate emergency, and he decided to put money there, but not on pensioners' pockets. I think that's just going to increase and increase. What I hope in this 4 or 5 year period is the Conservative side, so the Conservative Party reform, are able to rebuild and actually think about what it means to be a Conservative person in this country, what it means to be a Brit, like the conversation we're having today. I hope they use this opportunity to really dig deep within their own parties, either unite ideally, and really start to look at how bad things are going to get with Labour and how much the culture war is still a big issue, how much some of the actual Conservative values, I would argue they're not even Conservative. I think some of the common sense values that most people would agree with, whether you're left or right wing, e.g., family is important, being religious maybe is a good thing, like getting a job, wanting to get educated, one day wanting to be father, mother. I think these are not political things. They've become politicized. But my hope is, through the chaos of what's going to happen in the Labour Party, that the Conservative side almost find their feet and they finally unite and they finally have a voice for Britain. I think that's my hope.
Is there a standout for you in the leadership race for the Conservative Party?
I think whoever it is will have to grow into the role. I don't think there's anyone there.
Kemi Badenoch,
Kemi would be my...
Kemi,
if I had to vote right now, it'd be Kemi Badenoch. Definitely.
What do you like about her?
She seems to have a no-nonsense approach. She speaks the truth. She will say some things that aren't necessarily popular. I heard her talk about MP expenses the other day, and I actually kind of agreed with her. She basically alluded to the fact that it's expensive being an MP, and having a home in your constituency and then having one in London is not that it's not that easy for people. I would take it a step further. I've said this before. I think MPs should get paid more. I think they should be less, but I think they should be paid more. I don't think, if you want the brightest and best people in the world, which is what we should be aspiring for in this country, then I don't think 80k over a 4 year period where you may lose your job at any point because of a snap election is really going to attract the right people. I think if you think it's necessarily a lot of money, then I think you're also down the path of being a career politician where you make decisions on the basis of just trying to get re-elected, which I think we saw a lot in the previous government. I think it means that people will be unafraid to make tough, bold decisions in terms of what they believe in. So I think the fact that Kemi is able to say these stuff, I really like. But I do think that whoever it is of the four, they're going to have to grow into the role. I don't think you have a ready-made leader that's ready to control this country tomorrow. I think they will have to naturally, over the course of these 3-4 years, grow into the role.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, it's a topic I know very little about, except that I have seen protesters on Whitehall and I've seen them in Trafalgar Square when it's related to the Bangladesh, what's going on in Bangladesh. Now, this is something that you've spoken out about. I wondered if you could give me and the listeners a history of what exactly is going on. I know that hundreds of people have been killed in riots, that the Prime Minister has had to flee the country. There's been mass migration as a consequence of various politics that's going on there. But I don't understand exactly what is going on. Can you explain it to me as if I know nothing, which I I know next to nothing?
Yeah, sure. Bangladesh is a new country, right? So it's in relative terms a very new country. It was formed in 1971 through a lot of the help from India being formed, and it's a country that's always been largely Muslim, a region that's always been largely a Muslim community. The riots that happened following Sheikh Hasina fleeing the country, the Prime Minister, I think it raised a lot of attention to something that's been going on in Bangladesh for a very long time, which is the treatment of minorities there. So the riots weren't necessarily because of the treatment towards minorities. I think it's more of an issue economically. They've been in economic decline for quite some time. Sheikh Hasina, what really sparked this off was she essentially employed a quota system amongst the people in Bangladesh who had helped form the independence, who were part of the independence. I can't remember the specific part of their army.
Back in 1971.
Back in 1971. So if you're a descendant of those people, you can, there's quota systems in place for them to get jobs.
What types of jobs?
Mainly government official jobs.
Okay.
So like in parliamentary sort of job, their equivalent. She revoked it. Because it was a deeply unpopular thing.
That's not actually anything to do with ethnicity?
Nothing to do with ethnicity, no.
It's just descendants of...
Just descendants.
Sort of political activists.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So it's like her idea of paying respect to them. She revoked it because it was deeply unpopular. She then reenacted it. And that, if you like, was a catalyst. That, the country's been in decline for quite a long time economically. She's been a very unpopular leader for the last few years. I think she's in her third term. There's been a lot of Bangladesh is a country that's struggling, and I think this policy was like the tipping point where it's like you have no idea what you're doing kind of thing, and it very quickly turned violent, and it very quickly turned into a mass protest, and especially amongst young people who are, their opportunities in Bangladesh are quite poor at the moment in terms of they're suffering very badly economically. But what it did is it started to raise awareness in terms of the minorities in Bangladesh. So a lot of the rioters decide to use this as an opportunity to go after minorities in Bangladesh, essentially saying, you shouldn't be here, or, you're, some of them are doing better than the native people of that country, or the Muslim population of the country.
Can you give me a little bit of a demographic overview of the country? I know there's population about 180 million.
Yeah. So
and so when you say minorities, who are the minorities? How many of them are there, and what's the spread?
The vast majority of the minorities are Hindu. There is a Christian population, but the vast majority is Hindu in terms of minority. So when Bangladesh was formed in the 1970s, the Hindu population was around 28%. So around 28%. Today, it's 8%.
Oh.
So each year, there is around, I've got it here, so more than 200,000 each year Hindus leave Bangladesh.
For India?
For India, mainly India, sometimes Sri Lanka, but largely
Britain
India.
has quite a big Bangladeshi population as well.
Yes, yeah. The majority of the British Bangladeshi community is Muslim.
Okay.
The Hindus in Bangladesh typically go to India. India does also help them come over, make it easier for them to come over.
This, by the way, just to tie back to Britain, this year have been riots in Whitechapel.
Yeah.
And around Tower Hamlets, which is, Tower Hamlets, I believe, is 35% Bangladeshi.
Oh, wow.
Heritage, the demographic there. So this actually even ties into some of our earlier conversations about riots and two-tier policing in Britain, because there was not the same justice on those riots as there were on the, if you want to call them, the English riots of post-Southport. But sorry, let's go back to Bangladesh properly.
But so it's not a new thing, right? That's the thing with this Royal Month. This is 200,000 that's been happening each year since its inception, right? And it's the population has decreased drastically, and we saw during the riots, which got a bit of attention, them defaming Hindu temples and making them basically to a point where it's just not a safe place for them.
This is this year.
This is this year, yeah. So they've upped the ante, if you like, at some of these the rioters in Bangladesh. And so
how did it get from being about the descendants of this political class to becoming an ethnic issue?
Well, so initially it's
or rather a religious separation.
But initially it wasn't. Initially it was just going against frustrations of the country, economically suffering. And then I think it very quickly, you could see maybe the economic impact to the Hindu communities probably isn't as much. They're doing reasonably well there. Starts to very quickly descend into Sheikh Hasina, the prime minister, being somebody who is supportive of the Hindu community. When I don't think
she's Muslim, though, right?
She's Muslim, yeah. I don't think she's done anything, out remotely supportive of the Hindu community. Then it takes its own life. And if you see people doing well, and you see a group, Jews face it in this country, right? They get it all the time for no reason, anti-Semitism, just because they're successful and wealthy. And I think it's similar to what happens in Hindus in Bangladesh. And they've made it to a point where it's just not, it's not feasible for them to be there. So they've had to go largely to India. That was one of the few positive things from the riots that have just happened in Bangladesh's attention towards it. It was nice to see people actually saying, this is actually crazy that this is actually happening, and no one's talked about it for the last 50 years. But we're talking about it now because, videos were shared of them trying to attack Hindu temples and stuff like this. So that was one of the positives of these unfortunate riots. But it's an example of it's a really tough thing to talk about, because a bit alluding to the grooming gangs and two-tier policing, all this sort of stuff, you've got to be very careful when you talk about this stuff. There's a reason why a lot of the mainstream media outlets didn't do a lot on this, is because there is almost like a playbook that I think that a lot of the Bangladeshi and sometimes the Pakistani community uses, which is, intimidation, often physical, verbal intimidation. And then it's about almost quickly becoming the victim. And these are the sort of two sides that they have. So they'll either play with a victim card, if not, then you go towards intimidation. And it's a massive problem for two minorities specifically in this country, which are Jews and Hindus. And
we're talking about Britain now.
Britain now, yeah. So it's a reoccurring problem, and it's a problem that the left has no idea in terms of how to deal with, which is you have two minorities who are doing better on average than the native population, than Christians, on pretty much every single scale you can look at, whether it's economically, senior managerial positions, least likely to go to jail. On a proportional statistic, Jews and Hindus in this country are doing better than the native Christians here,
and Chinese,
so specifically with these two religions, it then becomes a bit of a problem, because it defeats the whole left thing of this is an institutionally or systemically racist country. It dismisses critical race theory. It dismisses the fact that white people are suppressing other coloured people in this country. It kind of really dispels a lot of that theory and a lot of that nonsense we hear in this country. So for them, when there's news on India or Israel, a country full of Jews, a country full of Hindus, the news is going to be largely negative, or just won't be reported, because it doesn't feed into their narrative, which is you're a victim.
Sorry, just so I've got understood this. When British Muslims or minorities hear news about Indian Hindus,
British natives, white Brits, yeah,
hear news about Indian unrest, it's negative against
it'd be negative about the country.
Hindus.
It'd be negative about
India.
It'd be negative about India, and it'd be largely negative Israel. They won't give a fair assessment of what's going on in those two countries because they are full of a religious
British media.
British media.
Yeah.
They're full of, these two countries are full of groups of people that are largely more successful in this country. So if you're
Perceived oppressors.
yeah, perceived. So and
This is
so
very postmodernist. Okay.
how do you combat that? You paint those pictures in a bad light, because how do you say to the average Jewish British Jew, the average British Hindu, that you've been oppressed and you're being oppressed, and it's not fair what's going on in this country. It's not fair how you're oppressed by the white person. It's not fair how you're not doing as well when they are, and in some cases they're doing better. So it goes against that kind of you need help narrative that they like to portray onto you. So what that means is any symbolism when it comes, anything that gets reported about these two groups of people is not going to be necessary to be in the most positive light, because they don't need the help. They don't want to be felt like victims, and they don't need to. And I'd argue most minorities feel the same way. They don't want the help. They want what we talked about being based on merit and moving up the social ladder based on merit. But unfortunately, I think it's a big reason why the news towards those two groups of people will never be fair, and they will never be fair or reasonable. And I think it's almost.
So who would be an example about this? Is this how the BBC are reporting on it? Because
well, they're not reporting on
it. They won't even touch it.
They wouldn't touch it, because why would they? They're going to get probably hate emails, hate messages towards them. It's not worth the risk. Hindus, like,
or certainly.
Jews.
Modi is depicted as a kind of strong man.
Yeah.
Negatively, he kind of fits that, the authoritarian. Well, I never see anything positive about Modi. He's in the progressive mind, he's one of the baddies.
Well, and with that, he was voted last year. I can't remember which poll it was, but they did a poll where he's the most popular leader in the world.
Is that right?
So in the
it's the biggest country. He's got some advantages.
Yeah, he's got an advantage. They did do it via percentage, so he won via percentage, the most popular leader in the whole world. But again, exactly what you said. If you saw that on the BBC, you would not. There's nothing that gives you that inclination that he's popular. So I think that's part of the problem with the thing with the British Jews and British Hindus. I think. There are much more. This is one of the downsides of being so adaptive, is they will very rarely speak about these things. It's very much head down, get on with your job, get on with life. And I think that's one of the reasons also you won't see the propaganda machine like you will for other communities, because it just doesn't interest them. It's just not what it's very against their culture to speak out about these sort of things. It's more focus, get educated, get a job, like it doesn't matter. So that's also, I think, another reason why, again, what goes on in Israel and India, I think, is always going to be perceived by the West in a negative light, rather than the accuracy of what's going on, because other cultures are much better at their propaganda machine, the victimization, and all this sort of stuff. And so I think that's why what's going on in Bangladesh, like I said, one of the nice things about what happened with the riots is it did give some attention towards.
I'm not sure I fully understand Bangladesh, so let's go back to it then. So what is happening now? The Prime Minister is gone, and who's in government? Who's running the country?
So the military took over. There are supposed to be elections happening any time now, and she said, well, her son has said she will return. Sheikh Hasina will return. She's currently in India.
Is she popular? Is it a minority who hate her? Has she lost
her
popularity?
Popularity's declined. It has been declining. Some of that is a third term, like naturally the decline wanting change. Some of that is the economic consequences of her being in power for so long, maybe just the country being in general decline, frustration. There is definitely, whether people will have the courage to say this, there's definitely a growth in Islamic extremism in Bangladesh. I think that's having an impact on her. I don't think she necessarily is.
Why is there a growth of Islamic extremism in Bangladesh?
I think in a lot of these countries where the military has so much power, and the military, it's not like here is like it is here in Britain. They're almost like different categories, right? So here you have the government who essentially not dictate to the military, but they act on the government's request. It doesn't work like that in a lot of the countries in Asia where the military has its own power. They have their own leaders. You have to get along with the leader of the military, as even if you're Keir Starmer in Bangladesh, the equivalent, you have to get along with, you need to win his endorsement. If you don't win his endorsement, that's a massive problem for you, and it's going to be a problem for you for some time. So there's so many different fractions within. You've got tribal leaders. There's so many different fractions, and it's very hard to keep them in check. And Pakistan had that with Imran Khan, who was seen initially as quite a Western leader. Somebody who played cricket and one of their greatest cricket players, dated Jemima Goldsmith. Somebody who's perceived as very liberal. He fell short in terms of found it very difficult to get the military on side, get the tribal leaders on side. It's tough because you're having a constant battle between being on the world stage and being open to the world and trying to grow your economy, but then also trying to manage expectations at home where you've got more traditional and orthodox people in your country. So it's a constant battling ground. The Middle East, especially in regions like Dubai and Saudi Arabia, they do a phenomenal job of controlling extremism from these countries, and they operate in a way that I think works really well for them. And I think that's probably the more it's easier with, I think, their culture for the type of leadership they have in those countries than democracy. And I think that's the big question for them to answer, which is, does democracy work very well with Islamic culture? And I think that's a question for people with a lot more knowledge in terms of what goes on in that region, who from that region need to ask that question. How does it actually fit into the culture? Because I'm not so sure.
Do you think that's one of the problems we've had in Britain?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Because, look, I think Douglas Murray's talked a lot about this, but there's so many people who talked about it. We made that, I think one of the mistakes we maybe made in Iraq, Afghanistan is that belief in terms of that they will become democratic, right? That we're going to try and not enforce democracy, but we're going to show them the labors of democracy and how incredible it is. And I, for sure, would fight for democracy and say it is the best system, 100%. But I think you have to allow the people of that country to come to their own conclusion. They've got to make that decision themselves, because I think if you try to enforce it or you try to show them that, then they can often hold you, they can be resentful for that. And I think we've seen that in Afghanistan now. I think the collapse of Afghanistan with the Taliban coming back into power as quick as they did, I think there's been they've got to come to that themselves. And I think if you try to enforce it, I think what happens is you get the religious tribal leaders or the more extreme fractions really fight back. And I think that's, what happened in Afghanistan is not something any political person you spoke to. I remember having conversations with Republicans and Democrats when they were talking about the removal of the troops in Afghanistan. Every single one said within months Taliban will take over. It's a well-known thing that America and the West has failed in Afghanistan, that they're going to take over. It's been regardless of who's in power and whoever the leader is in terms of America. Obviously, I think the way Biden left Afghanistan was horrific, and I think it's horrible the fact that he let so many Afghani people who helped us during the years of war in Afghanistan. He left them there, took the troops out first. He should have protected those people who helped us, those Afghani native people that were trying to bring democracy there, left them there. The Americans, the Brits that helped us there, left them there. I think that was horrific. But regardless...
his own Americans.
His own...
Yeah.
Regardless,
not to mention the $7 billion of American military equipment that he left.
I think when people say it's one of the worst military operations, I think it's for sure that I don't blame him for what happened afterwards, because I think whoever the leader would have been, whether it was Trump or whoever, Taliban were going to take over. It was literally, it was no secret that was going to happen. The way it happened, I think, was a real disgrace, and I think it's really horrible for the people that helped us. But I think that's, going back to the question of Islam and democracy, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's a conversation that needs a lot of thought and a lot of people, I think, in that community to think about. I think it worked really well for us in the UK prior to the changes in the demographics in the last 15, 20 years. I think, there's a reason why there's so many successful Pakistani people in this country and have got successful businesses, and we see them in political positions and stuff. And I think there's a reason why that a lot of them came from, or their parents came from the 70s, 80s, 90s. I think now it's a different ball game, because that demographic change is completely shifted. It's completely changed. You no longer have to be around people that are different to you in that community. You can go to an Islamic primary school, an Islamic secondary school, go to your halal butchers after to do your groceries, go to Islamic after school clubs. I mean, what adaptation are you going to have into this country? And I think it's unfortunate because it's tough on the children, because they're not getting exposure to what is incredible about Britain, which is that adaptive nature. So I think that's the real worry.
Yeah. I don't love to leave on pessimistic notes. Do you have where do you find optimism in these troubling times?
I think people like yourself and like this, like having the courage to talk about this. I'm not sure, maybe 3-4 years ago there was as many people like yourself who have these sort of platforms to talk about it. I think definitely there are more and more people speaking up. I think less and less people are being intimidated by. I think they're realizing they're not a minority. I think they're a silent majority, and I think a lot of them are becoming less silent. So that gives me optimism. And I also, what gives me optimism is this isn't a political issue. I've seen so many people on the left, or who I perceive on the left, who are saying very basic common sense things, and they're not afraid to say them, even though in their left wing community they're being ostracized. So I think that's really, really nice to see. So I think that's promising. And I think the more people like yourself give this like amazing platforms, have these conversations, I think it's only going to do the world of good, because I guarantee there'll be some people that will, you know, when I watch you tune in, it's like, yeah, I agree, but they just won't. They will think that they're in the minority when they're not. So that fills me with some optimism.
Sunil, my last question for you: will you be running in 5 years at the next general election?
No. I have a genuine patriotism towards this country. I feel grateful to be born here. I feel so lucky to have see my parents progress and do amazing things with me as a child, and have like great opportunities which I've had. 5 years is definitely too short. I've recently got married.
Congratulations!
I'm on a different path in that sense. I want to focus on making money, trying to be more successful in my job, and if the time's right, maybe in the future, I would love to for sure be involved in British politics. I just don't think I think I cannot be involved. I think I've done that, with whether it's helping somebody posting leaflets through a letterbox, or whether it's doing stuff like this. I definitely want to be involved in British politics for the foreseeable future. Running as an MP right now, just personally, just doesn't really interest me.
Not yet. Yeah. Sunil Sharma, where can people find you? Where can they follow you? How can they learn more about you?
So just all on social media. I've got the same @ on all platforms, which is just @Sunil Sharma UK. And you can do it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It's all the same. Brilliant. Sunil, thank you so much for speaking with me. Thank you. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Sunil Sharma. If you want to support the show, remember all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Sunil exploring the issues that you want to talk about. But for now, be well.